Hey everybody, and welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Napoleon's Marshals Part 4 by Epic History TV. So far, I've been really enjoying this series. I really like the detail we've been getting on the background, personality, and career of each of Napoleon's marshals, and I like how the further into the series we get, the more detail we give to each individual marshal. So yeah, I'm excited to get into this video. If you guys end up enjoying this reaction, I'd appreciate it if you would check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. And without any further ado, let's jump into this reaction.
Terror belli, decus pacis. Terror in war, ornament in peace. The words inscribed on every French marshal's baton. In France, the title of Marshal, or Maréchal, goes back at least to the 13th century. It represents the highest possible position of military authority. Authority symbolized by a marshal's baton. The title was abolished during the French Revolution, as incompatible with the egalitarian spirit of the age. But in 1804, Napoleon founded a new empire and restored the ancient rank.
You know, and I've sort of made a similar point before. Napoleon, in some ways, was continuing the goals of the revolution and the values of the revolution, but in other ways, he was something completely different. You know, he wants to reestablish some of the ornamentation and honors typical of a traditional monarchy. He wants to legitimize his rule as equal to other monarchies throughout Europe. And, well, I mean, I'm sure he saw himself as superior to those others, given he had the skill and ability to conquer all of them anyway. But, you know, he still wanted some of that traditional symbolism.
This is Epic History TV's guide to Napoleon's marshals. All 26 have been ranked according to our own evaluation of their achievements as marshals, with expert guidance from Lieutenant Colonel Rémy Porte, former chief historian of the French Army. So far, we've met Marshals Pérignon, Brune, Serrurier, Kellerman, Grouchy, Moncey, Poniatowski, Jourdan, Bernadotte, Augereau, Lefebvre, Mortier, Marmont, Saint-Cyr, Oudinot, Victor, and Murat.
And let me tell you, we haven't even got to the best of the best yet. But this group of men that we're looking at right now is a very impressive collection of talent. You know, there are a lot of interesting characters here, a lot of respectable characters, some perhaps less reputable, but, you know, all interesting from one reason or another, and most of them are very skilled at what they do. And that really shows you that even though we don't even have the top 9 marshals, this is a very impressive group. And, you know, clearly Napoleon selected these men very deliberately, and he made some intelligent selections.
Who could be a more fitting video sponsor than NapoleonSouvenirs.com?
Well, there you go. That's a great sponsorship. You guys know the deal. I will link their video in the description down below. Please go and give them a like, subscribe to their channel, and check out their sponsor to show Epic History TV some support for the fantastic videos that they make.
Thank you to NapoleonSouvenirs.com for sponsoring this video.
Nice.
9. Marshal Bessières.
Bessières. Okay, that's some high praise from Napoleon.
Jean-Baptiste Bessières was the son of a surgeon with a relatively prosperous upbringing in southwestern France. When the French Revolution began, he volunteered for the National Guard and was sent to Paris to join the King's Constitutional Guard.
You know, pretty typical story we've seen play out many times throughout this group. middle-class background. Seems like Bessières was more upper-middle class, got involved in the military early in the Revolution, and we go from there.
Along with his old school friend, Joachim Murat.
Ah, there he is.
This unit was soon disbanded, but Bessières remained in Paris and was among the soldiers defending the Tuileries Palace when it was stormed by the mob on the 10th of August 1792. In the aftermath, he needed to get out of Paris in a hurry, so he volunteered to fight on the Pyrenees front. His bravery and good sense won him a commission in the 22nd Chasseurs, and he distinguished himself at the Battle of Boulou. Transferred to Italy, his friendship with Murat got him noticed by the army commander, General Bonaparte, who was impressed enough to make him commander of his new bodyguard, known as Les Guides de Bonaparte. Bessières distinguished himself as a cavalry commander in Italy.
Well, there you go. Here's another figure who was alongside Napoleon from relatively early. We've seen a good number of marshals who weren't with Napoleon from super early, but also a good chunk of them that had accompanied Napoleon from his early campaigns in Italy and Egypt. And of course, some of them got to him through other marshals. Bessières knew Murat, who, by the way, just a throwback to the last video, he was perhaps the most interesting figure of them all so far. I don't know if, there's some competition, but he was a really entertaining one to learn about.
And later, Egypt, winning promotion to brigadier and loyally supporting Napoleon at every turn. He became one of the few men that Napoleon regarded as a true friend.
Wow.
When Napoleon became first consul of France in 1799, he rewarded Bessières with command of the elite Consular Guard cavalry, which he led with devastating effect at Marengo the next year. In 1804, Bessières became a marshal, less for any great military achievement than for being a loyal member of Napoleon's inner circle. Bessières himself was well-liked, kind, well-mannered and generous.
Seems like Bessières was very much, as they said, an inner circle kind of guy. He was accompanying Napoleon, well-trusted, commanding his guard. And, we've seen marshals get given their position for different reasons. Some of them for loyalty, others for just straight-up skill, talent, or achievement. And others, a smaller group, for political reasons. A couple of the marshals Napoleon created early on were for mostly PR or political reasons.
A pious Catholic and social conservative who liked to powder his hair in the old style.
Yeah, I imagine he was probably pretty disillusioned by the revolution after a few years. This definitely sounds like the kind of upper middle class guy who got involved in 1789 because the revolution represented his interests and his beliefs. And then, I don't know him, but judging on what they have just told me, I would assume that as the revolution grew more radical and more anti-Catholic, he probably became rather disillusioned with it. We saw he was defending the Tuileries Palace against a mob, and so I'd imagine he's more on the moderate conservative side of the revolution.
His young wife, Marie-Jeanne, was also a favorite at court, doted on by Napoleon and Empress Josephine. In 1805, Bessières commanded the Imperial Guard. In December that year, at the Battle of Austerlitz, he played a crucial role repelling the Russian Guard at the battle's climax. At Eylau in 1807, his squadrons supported Murat's mass cavalry charge and made their own disciplined attacks to cover his withdrawal. However, Bessières' opportunities for glory were limited. Napoleon always held the Guard back as his last reserve, as at Friedland. In 1808, Bessières received his first major independent command in northern Spain. That May, the country erupted in revolt against the French. Bessières reacted quickly and decisively, securing key towns and roads. He then attacked Spanish forces at Medina de Rioseco, winning a crushing victory against an enemy that outnumbered him 2-1.
Okay, so he's number 9, right? And I know from what some of you guys were commenting that Epic History TV will tend to rank the Marshals who could act independently successfully a little higher. And I was sort of wondering, I wonder why Bessières is 9. Why is he higher than Murat, for example? Because so far, he's just been a loyal but maybe not spectacular marshal. But I suppose this is something that might set him apart. Quick and decisive action without the direct orders of Napoleon telling him what to do.
But once the immediate crisis had passed, he hesitated and failed to exploit his victory. When Napoleon arrived in Spain, Bessières was given command of the reserve cavalry, a role he retained for the war against Austria in 1809. In May, Bessières and his cavalry were among the first across the Danube, with Messena occupying the village of Aspern on his left and Lannes holding Essling on the right. When the Austrian commander, Archduke Charles, launched a massive and unexpected counterattack, Bessières, outnumbered 4-1, made a series of desperate charges, helping to save the army from disaster.
Wow.
It came at a high cost. Bessières and his cavalry performed bravely. But that night, a long-running feud with Marshal Lannes nearly came to blows when Lannes accused Bessières of hanging back. The matter went no further, as Lannes was fatally wounded the next day. Bessières commanded the cavalry again at Wagram, leading a major attack to cover Masséna's redeployment to the left wing.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like Bessières was perhaps a bit cautious, but I don't think there was legitimacy to Lannes' critique, although maybe there was. Maybe some of you guys can tell me, but, seemingly a cautious commander, but not, necessarily one that would put the fate of the battle in jeopardy. Although, in Spain, the French forces suffered from his hesitation, so I don't know.
As the charge began, a cannonball killed Bessières' horse and injured his leg. A rumor reached the Imperial Guard that Bessières was dead. Some old veterans began to weep for their old commander, until they were assured he was only wounded. That was quite a cannonball, Napoleon told Bessières. It reduced my guard to tears. As a devout Catholic, Bessières was critical of Napoleon's divorce from Empress Josephine, leading to a short spell out of favor. In 1811, he was sent back to Spain to command the Army of the North. He found an impossible situation, a widespread insurgency and insufficient troops and supplies.
Yeah, I will say, and I mentioned this last time, regardless of how well you performed in Spain, some marshals tried their best, and some really did not. They were just focused on looting and personally enriching themselves. Regardless of where you place on that spectrum, the French were just not having a good time in Spain. It was, just really difficult to find a good outcome if you were a French marshal. So, you can sort of judge on performance in Spain, but it didn't really go well for anybody.
He wrote bluntly to Napoleon, stating that the French must give up territory, something the Emperor would never allow.
Yeah, it makes a good point.
For all his piety and refined manners, Bessières ordered his share of executions and reprisals in his attempt to pacify northern Spain.
Yikes.
Brutal methods used by many French commanders in this conflict.
Yeah, the conflict in Spain was a particularly brutal one, and for Bessières, that's against his fellow Catholics, Spanish Catholics. They shared the same faith, yet he would still inflict brutality against them. Of course, like I said, the French were not having an easy time in Spain, and they were basically doing whatever they could to hold on to the conquered territory. And as we saw, Bessières suggested to Napoleon that they should give up some of that territory, to make the occupation more feasible. But under the current circumstances, it was just a brutal occupation, brutal for the civilians on the ground. And many of them fought back with guerrilla warfare. Just a really difficult time for the Spanish people.
Later that year, he joined forces with Marshal Masséna's army of Portugal to take on Wellington's army at the Battle of Fuentes de Oñoro, but was widely blamed for refusing to send in his cavalry to support Masséna's attacks.
Okay, so we are seeing more of Bessières' caution spring up again, and perhaps it is detrimental to the French war effort, because we've heard of it a couple times, and he's been criticized for it a couple times.
Unfortunately for Napoleon, this was typical of how many marshals behaved in his absence. They'd rather watch another marshal fail than help them to win all the glory. In 1812, Bessières accompanied Napoleon into Russia, commanding his Guard cavalry. Since the Guard was kept in reserve, he saw little action until the retreat, when he led the advance guard, clearing a path for the survivors.
Right.
The disaster in Russia left Bessières severely demoralized, but he was resolved to do his duty, now serving once more as Napoleon's cavalry commander in Marshal Murat's absence. On the 1st of May 1813, Bessières was scouting enemy positions before the Battle of Lützen, when a cannonball hit him in the chest, killing him instantly.
Wow.
His death robbed Napoleon of a dependable commander and one of his last remaining friends.
That's tough.
It is surely a great loss for you and your children, Napoleon wrote to his widow, but an even greater one for me.
Okay, seems like a little of an insensitive thing to say to his widow, but he's making the point that he really valued Bessières, so I understand that. Yeah, he seems like he was steady. He was loyal, he was dependable. Napoleon could always count on him, though perhaps sometimes a little overly cautious. But overall, seemingly a very good marshal, and one suited to command Napoleon's Guard, I would say. And clearly, perhaps a little cautious, but not cowardly. He was clearly brave. He was willing to put himself out there. He never, sometimes he hesitated to make an action or an advance, but, he was never afraid to get into the action himself. It seems like his caution was merely temperamental and not from any sort of cowardice or anything like that. He appears to have been brave and courageous, like most of the other marshals. So, I'd say a pretty respectable choice for number 9.
8. Marshal Mcdonald.
Marshal Mcdonald.
Jacques Macdonald's father was a Scotsman who'd supported Bonnie Prince Charlie's bid to seize the British throne in 1745.
Okay, very interesting. Obviously, we've heard of Macdonald before in the main series, and I always thought it's a very interesting combination. Jacques, very French name. Macdonald, very Scottish. But this makes sense. He's the son of a Scottish emigre, shout out to Jacques in the first place. Shout out to the homeland, Scotland. But this makes sense. So Bonnie Prince Charlie basically fought a war in the United Kingdom against English forces, basically in favor of restoring the Stuart monarchy. And he led what we call the Jacobites, who were supporters of the Stuart monarchy and Catholics. And they were largely concentrated in Scotland. And the main Jacobite uprising, as you can see on the screen, was in 1745. It's kind of presented in modern-day Scotland as a sort of like like Scottish independence struggle, you know, Scottish patriots versus the English. It's not entirely true. That's not really what it was about. It was, you know, a lot about the Stuart dynasty and religion, Catholicism versus Protestantism. But yeah, and importantly for this, the French supported that struggle. You know, Catholic France supported the Catholic Jacobites against the Protestant English. And so that's why his father would have emigrated to France. That would have been the connection there.
After this ended in defeat at Culloden, the family fled to France.
Yep.
Inspired
I've been to Culloden, by the way.
by tales of the Trojan War, Macdonald chose a military life and became a lieutenant in Dillon's Irish Regiment, a French unit made up mostly of Irish émigrés.
As you can see, France also had ties to Ireland. So, you know, this was part of France's long-standing attempt to annoy the English, basically. So, you know, they would ally and support Catholic forces on the British Isles, such as Catholic Irish or the Catholic Jacobites in Scotland, to try and disrupt British affairs. To, you know, not much success in this case. They had more success funding the American rebels, but they were always trying to disrupt the English government.
In the Revolutionary Wars, he won a reputation as a hard-working, intelligent and brave officer, and served as aide-de-camp to General Dumouriez, commanding the Army of the North. He distinguished himself in that general's famous victory at Jemappes, paving the way for rapid promotion from lieutenant to general in just 2 years. He led his division well during campaigns in Holland and Germany, and formed a close bond with one of France's most successful commanders of this period, General Moreau.
Okay, interesting. So, seems like Mcdonald had a lot of action pre-Napoleon. I mean, a lot of the, well, maybe not a lot, but a good portion of the other marshals did as well, but seems like Macdonald in particular was quite active in the sort of early Revolutionary Wars.
In 1798, he was sent to Rome as governor, and later commanded the army of Naples. Summoned north the following year to reinforce Moreau's army of Italy, he was nearly killed in a skirmish with Austrian cavalry, and while still suffering from his wounds, his army was defeated at the Trebia by a larger coalition force commanded by the great Russian general Suvorov. But Macdonald's own conduct won approval from General Bonaparte, among others.
Okay.
Later that year, he assisted Napoleon's seizure of power in the coup of 18 Brumaire, ensuring the loyalty of the troops at Versailles. He was rewarded with an army command in Switzerland, and that winter led his men through the Alps to attack the Austrians in Italy. His march was far more challenging and dangerous than Napoleon's, but was never immortalized in quite the same way. In 18...
Well, yes, I mean, Napoleon was obviously a brilliant military mind, but one of his other qualities was that he was a brilliant political mind, and part of that was that Napoleon was always great at PR. You know, he was always great at marketing his own success. Julius Caesar was very similar in this regard, so Napoleon always made sure to have people along, historians along, chronicling his successes, artists along to paint his victories, and he could send them all back to Paris to, you know, inspire the people and get them on his side. So, you know, that's, obviously Macdonald didn't have that. He's not Napoleon. So regardless of, you know, whose crossing into Italy was more impressive, Napoleon would certainly make sure that his was more famous. And he was very skilled at that throughout his career.
In 1804, Macdonald's former commander, General Moreau, was arrested and charged with involvement in a plot to assassinate Napoleon. Macdonald stood up for his friend's reputation, an act of loyalty typical of the man.
Nice.
But disastrous for his career. Moreau was exiled. Macdonald was placed under police surveillance and retired to his country estate in disgrace. 5 years passed before Napoleon, desperate for experienced senior commanders, asked him to serve as military advisor to his 27-year-old stepson, Prince Eugène, now commanding the army of Italy.
Wow. So 5 years. Macdonald lost 5 years of his career for standing up for his friend. That is quite a heavy price to pay. I wonder if he would have still done it if he'd known that. He does seem like a loyal guy, but yeah, that's rough. I wonder if, I'm sure some of you guys know if Moreau was actually involved in the conspiracy or not, and to what extent his exile was justified. Regardless, Macdonald is standing up for a friend, which, I can respect that.
Macdonald and Eugène worked well together, driving back the Austrians, and by an awesome feat of marching, joined Napoleon near Vienna.
Nice.
In time for the Battle of Wagram. The second day of the battle was Macdonald's moment. Entrusted by the Emperor with the main attack on the enemy centre, he formed his troops into a giant, open-backed square and advanced into a hail of fire.
I mean, he's been described as brave. That certainly seems appropriate here.
Napoleon, watching through his telescope, exclaimed several times, "What a brave man!
Wow.
What a brave man!" Macdonald's costly attack helped to secure a great victory. The next day, Napoleon went to find him on the battlefield and greeted him with the words, "Let us be friends from now. You have acted valiantly and given me the greatest services. On the battlefield of your glory, where I owe you so large a part of yesterday's success, I make you a Marshal of France. You have long deserved it."
Wow, how about that? That's what we like to call a movie moment. It's very Hollywood. Macdonald's been disgraced 5 years in his country estate. He finally gets called back to service. He has his big moment with Napoleon looking on, and then, Napoleon comes to award him with the position of Marshal. It's a very Hollywood moment, but, history's like that sometimes. And, I mean, historians can definitely gin up the details sometimes, so I'm not sure, because I haven't read the sources, of course, how 100% true that scene they just presented is, but I'm sure that, the message is true, which is Macdonald really showed his worth to Napoleon during that battle, and was thus granted his position as Marshal, so, I think that's definitely a testament to his bravery, which was extremely clear in that battle.
In addition, Macdonald received the title Duke of Taranto and a large pension. But as time would prove, his loyalty remained to France, not to Napoleon. Macdonald spent an unhappy year in Catalonia, commanding troops in what he regarded as an immoral war. In his memoirs, he even praised the noble and courageous resistance of the Spanish.
Yeah, I mean, I can respect that because I basically agree with him. That war was extremely brutal, and, I think many aspects of it were hard to justify from the French side. There was a lot of brutality against the locals. So even though, of course, that is some disloyalty to Napoleon, but I respect that he has some principles, although, he was still following orders, so, that's sort of a toss-up, but, I guess I like that he's at least thinking independently, and, being loyal to France over Napoleon isn't necessarily a bad thing. Oftentimes in this period they coincided, though. Eventually they wouldn't, so I assume we're going to see that divergence in Macdonald's story.
In 1812, he was given command of 10th Corps for the invasion of Russia. This corps, composed of German troops and reluctant Prussian allies, guarded the left flank of the invasion and had a relatively quiet campaign. In December, the Prussians suddenly agreed an armistice with the Russians, leaving the loyal remnants of Macdonald's corps to fight their way back to Poland. By 1813, Napoleon relied on Macdonald as one of his senior marshals. In August, he gave him command of the forces keeping watch on General Blücher's army of Silesia. But when Macdonald advanced across the Katzbach River, torrential rain and flooding caused chaos among his troops, just as they encountered Blücher's army. Blücher launched an immediate attack, and Macdonald's army was routed. Thousands of his new conscripts surrendered or deserted. Hundreds were driven into the river itself.
That's rough.
Macdonald took full responsibility for the disaster, though his lack of cavalry and some bad luck were also to blame.
I mean, I also respect that. Oh, Jesus, voice crack. I also respect that, taking responsibility for something you're in charge of, even though it seems like there were a lot of factors outside of his control, including the weather, outside of anybody's control, that really contributed to his defeat. But I do respect him taking responsibility there.
Napoleon certainly continued to respect Macdonald's military judgment.
Okay.
He
Fair.
continued to command 11th Corps and was in the thick of the fighting at Leipzig 2 months later. Macdonald was with the rear guard when the French retreat began and was shocked to see the chaos that engulfed the army. When the Elster Bridge was blown too early, he himself was trapped on the wrong side of the river and just managed to swim to safety under enemy fire.
Yeah, definitely. And a few of the marshals have been like this, but definitely a man of action. He was always in there, always willing to fight. A real Scotsman to the heart. But he a brave guy. He was always putting himself on the line. Like I said, and that's been true of a couple of the marshals. But that's very respectable.
Macdonald continued to serve Napoleon as a loyal and reliable commander throughout the 1814 campaign, effectively serving as his deputy at several key moments. Unlike most marshals, Macdonald was never under Napoleon's spell, and always spoke his mind to the emperor.
Yeah, it seems like, and like I said earlier, I like this about him. He's a man who, militarily, he did have some independent command, but mostly followed orders, but followed them well, and with courage and bravery. But politically, he was a man who had his own opinions, thought for himself, and seemingly spoke his mind. He spoke his mind about his friend back in 1804, which, got him into Napoleon's bad books for a few years. So I respect that about Macdonald. He's someone who was not necessarily a blind follower of Napoleon like many people were, but he was able to think for himself.
This in itself was a valuable service, though it sometimes led to heated arguments.
I'm sure.
Perhaps inevitably, in April, it was Macdonald and Ney who took the lead in confronting Napoleon with the facts of his situation.
Yeah, like I mentioned earlier, this is not at all surprising. Macdonald was loyal to his country, and during this era, a lot of times loyalty to France would coincide with loyalty to Napoleon, but like I said, they would eventually diverge, and it's unsurprising that Macdonald was one of the first people to see that divergence. And, to be fair, I think he was right, Napoleon's position was untenable. He really couldn't go any further, and it was probably in France's best interest to try and get the best deal they could and to stop, fighting this ceaseless warfare. So, like I said, unsurprising that Macdonald would be at the forefront of this, but I don't blame him.
The war was lost, and he must abdicate. Napoleon named Macdonald as one of the 3 men who would negotiate with the Allies, telling his foreign minister, the Marquis de Caulaincourt, "Macdonald does not like me, but he is a man of his word, of high principles, and he can be relied on."
Yeah, and clearly Napoleon understands Macdonald as we're understanding him right now. I don't know if Macdonald actually didn't like Napoleon. I'm sure Napoleon was feeling quite under attack at this moment, but his statement is very true in that even though Macdonald, was leaving Napoleon behind at this point, basically, out of duty to his country, Macdonald, I think, was a man of principle and was a trustworthy guy. So regardless of how Macdonald felt about Napoleon, I think it really says something about Macdonald's character that Napoleon continued to trust him with that responsibility.
In their last meeting, a few days later, Napoleon told Macdonald, "I did not know you well. I was prejudiced against you. I have done so much for so many others who have abandoned me. And you, who owe me nothing, have remained faithful.
Wow.
I appreciate your loyalty. Too late."
Wow. That's, I'd be interested to see the source on that, like the exact scenario, the meeting itself, because that's very interesting. That is a rare instance of Napoleon basically admitting that he was wrong, that he missed something. He didn't, recognize and appreciate Macdonald's loyalty until it was too late. And, I think that's very fair. In the end, of course, Macdonald, left him behind, told him it was time to abdicate. But, regardless of Macdonald's personal feelings on what Napoleon was doing, he's been loyal all this time. He's followed orders. He's done a good job. And I think it seems that at the end, Napoleon saw that.
Macdonald was kept on as a military advisor by France's restored Bourbon monarchy. He continued to speak his mind, so much so that Louis XVIII nicknamed him his outspokenness.
That's funny.
During the 100 Days, Macdonald remained loyal to the king and attempted to rally troops to fight against Napoleon.
Yeah.
When he saw this was futile, he escorted the king to safety in Belgium, then returned to Paris, where he refused to meet with Napoleon.
Wow.
After the defeat at Waterloo, he was put in charge of demobilizing the last elements of Napoleon's Grande Armée, and helped many officers to escape arrest by the Bourbons.
Yeah, that fits. I'm not surprised that Macdonald wouldn't rejoin with Napoleon. Like we've covered, he's a man who thinks for himself. He's clear-headed, so he would not have been swayed by Napoleon's return, his charisma, as a lot of people were, especially when they saw him. And maybe that's why Macdonald didn't want to see him. He didn't want to risk being captured by Napoleon's spell. And then I'm also not surprised that he wanted to help out his former comrades, even, I'm sure, at risk to his own position. Like we've seen this whole time, Macdonald was a man that thought for himself and acted in accordance with his principles, regardless of the outcomes or regardless of the position he was in. He did what he felt was right. And I definitely respect that.
Macdonald was a methodical, reliable, if unspectacular commander.
Right.
But he distinguished himself, above all, by his lack of vanity or personal ambition, his complete loyalty to France, and his willingness to speak his mind, virtues that were all too rare among Napoleon's marshals.
Yeah. A unique figure amongst this group, I'll say that.
7. Marshal Messena.
Alright, Messena.
André Masséna was born in Nice, at that time not technically part of France, but of the Kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia. His father, a shopkeeper, died when he was young, so he ran away to sea, then at 17 enlisted in the French army. He was quickly made a sergeant, but a commoner could rise no higher in the Royal Army, so after 14 years' service he quit. When the French Revolution began, he re-enlisted in a local volunteer battalion.
familiar story once again.
Masséna, supremely self-confident and unfazed by any challenge, was elected to command the battalion and led it with success against the Austrians on the Piedmontese front.
Nice.
Despite his lack of education, he proved an instinctive combat leader. He was soon promoted to brigadier, and after leading a successful attack at the Siege of Toulon, was made General of Division. He won an impressive victory over the Austrians at Loarno in 1795, and when the Army of Italy's commander, General Scherer, resigned over lack of support from the government in Paris, many expected Masséna to replace him. Instead, the job went to the 26-year-old General Bonaparte, 11 years younger and much less experienced than Masséna, but with far better political connections.
Very true.
Nevertheless, Napoleon and Masséna worked together brilliantly.
Yeah, like I mentioned earlier, Napoleon was a brilliant military mind, but also a brilliant political mind. He knew how to play both sides of the coin, and I've already made this comparison, but like a Caesar, Julius Caesar. And that's what made him so successful.
Masséna commanded his advance guard and played a major role in several of his early victories. In reports, Napoleon described Masséna as active, tireless, audacious. He won so many battles that Napoleon acclaimed him l'enfant gâté de la victoire, the spoiled child of victory. Masséna was, however, notorious for extorting vast sums from the local Italians, often while his own troops went hungry and without pay.
Jeez.
In 1798, Masséna received his first independent command, the Army of Switzerland. The next spring, after French defeats on the Rhine and in Italy, responsibility for the defense of France lay in his hands. Rather than wait to be encircled, he attacked and won a brilliant victory over Austrian and Russian forces at the Battle of Zurich.
All right, there we go. And like was mentioned earlier, Epic History TV does like the Marshals with a bit of an independent streak. And Messena is showing there that, even without Napoleon, he can make Napoleon-like maneuvers. He can be decisive. He can take the initiative instead of remaining overly cautious and just waiting like some other marshals. He's clearly got some talent, His personal scruples, I'm not so sure. I'm not sure necessarily what his principles are, but regardless of his morals, he's clearly a talented, skillful commander.
Rewarded with command of the Army of Italy, Masséna led a heroic defense of Genoa in 1800. He was eventually starved into surrender, but his stubborn defense bought Napoleon enough time to cross the Alps and defeat the Austrians at Marengo. Physically exhausted by this last ordeal and surrounded by accusations of corruption, Masséna was recalled to Paris and went into semi-retirement. When he was made a marshal by Napoleon in 1804, he seemed distinctly underwhelmed, and on being congratulated, remarked, "There are 14 of us." But Masséna...
Wow. That's ambitious, or, I suppose someone with a big self-image of themselves. One of the top 14 selected in all of France, and that's not quite good enough.
was one of the few marshals who'd proved themselves in independent command, making him a priceless asset to Napoleon. In 1805, he was recalled to active service and given command of the Army of Italy in the war against the Third Coalition. Masséna kept Archduke Charles's army busy in Italy, while the Emperor won his great victories at Ulm and Austerlitz. In 1806, Masséna oversaw the occupation of the Kingdom of Naples, ordering brutal reprisals against local resistance.
Jeez.
In 1807, he commanded 5th Corps in Poland, but his role covering Warsaw meant he missed the major battles of Eylau and Friedland.
I'm sure he would have performed impressively at those battles.
To that year, while out hunting with the Emperor and his entourage at Fontainebleau, he was accidentally shot in the face and lost the use of an eye.
Jesus
Napoleon,
Christ.
a notoriously bad shot, was to blame.
Wow. That's a Dick Cheney moment.
But the loyal Marshal Berthier claimed responsibility.
Wow, okay, wow.
The war against Austria in 1809 saw Messena back near his best. His corps formed the vanguard for the crossing of the Danube and fought ferociously to hold the village of Aspern against an overwhelming Austrian onslaught. Masséna was everywhere, displaying his usual coolness under fire, and when ordered to retreat, ensured his troops pulled back across the river in good order. The battle was a defeat, but Masséna had been superb. Together, he and the Emperor oversaw preparations for the next attempt to cross the Danube 6 weeks later. The Austrians were waiting for them at the Battle of Wagram. Because of a riding accident a few days earlier, Masséna had to command his corps from a carriage. He made a fine target for Austrian gunners, but was still able to organize a complex redeployment of his corps at the height of the battle, covered by Marshal Bessières' cavalry charge. Masséna's bold maneuver secured the French left flank and won further praise from Napoleon. Masséna, already ennobled as the Duke of Rivoli, received a new title, Prince of Essling, and another less welcome reward, command of French forces for the invasion of Portugal. Masséna was deeply reluctant to go and complained bitterly about his appointment.
Yep, as always, the Iberian Peninsula was not a good place for the Grande Armée. It was not a good place to be as a marshal because you were probably not going to see that many successes regardless of how talented you were. So I can understand his reluctance.
He was showing clear signs of exhaustion and was plagued by rheumatism and bad lungs.
Yeah, also, to be fair, seems like he's had a rough go of it recently. I'm sure perhaps he needed a break, to be honest.
When he arrived in Spain, General Foy observed, "He's only 52, but he looks more than 60. He's lost weight and has begun to stoop. His glance, since the accident in which he lost an eye, has lost its keenness."
Yeah.
His subordinates, already underwhelmed by his appearance, were outraged that the Marshal also decided to bring along his mistress, poorly disguised as an officer of dragoons.
What?
The French invasion of Portugal proved a disaster, undone by Wellington's scorched earth tactics, a hostile population and terrain, and Masséna's own lethargic leadership.
Yeah, I mean, that's just a bad situation. You know, Messena clearly needed a break at that point. He was not doing well health-wise. The Iberian Peninsula was a bad place to be, whether in Spain or Portugal. The populace was very hostile. Not to mention Wellington was a fearsome opponent. So just, part of the responsibility, of course, has to go to Messena, but he wasn't really in much of a state to command anyway, and he was facing some pretty insurmountable odds.
His corps commanders, especially Marshal Ney, were scathing of his conduct.
Ooh.
At Busaco, Masséna squandered lives with an unnecessary frontal attack on a strong British position. When he reached Lisbon, he found the city protected by new fortifications, the impregnable lines of Torres Vedras.
Yep.
Masséna waited outside Lisbon for reinforcements that never came, while sickness and guerrilla raids took their toll on his army. 5 months later, he recrossed the mountains back into Spain, leaving a string of devastated villages behind him. The next summer, at Fuentes de Oñoro, Masséna attacked Wellington's army once more, and despite much hard fighting, again failed to win a clear victory. He blamed Marshal Bessières for his lack of support. But the Emperor's patience was at an end. He sent Marshal Marmont to replace Masséna, and when they next met, greeted him with the cutting words, "So, Prince of Essling, you are no longer Messena."
Jesus, yeah. We've seen a lot of quotes from Napoleon throughout this series regarding his marshals, and goddamn, that guy really knew how to, like, really attack people verbally. A lot of really brutal quotes from Napoleon. He was clearly not a man to mince words. If he looked down on you or thought badly of you, he would tell you, and he would tell you in the most hurtful way possible. We've just seen some absolutely brutal quotes from Napoleon.
Massena's health was now in steep decline. He never held a major command again.
So, you know, it's a pretty bad end to his career, but to look at the thing as a whole, you know, he's quite successful and clearly very talented. So I would say that, you know, his failures in Portugal are not really representative of his career or his abilities as a whole.
Though he was recalled in 1813 to supervise a military district in southern France. He died after a long illness in 1817. In his prime, Masséna was a superb commander, incisive and dangerous. But he was past his best by the time he became a marshal.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, there were enough sparks of his old brilliance to worry his adversaries. The Duke of Wellington once remarked, "When Masséna was opposed to me in the field, I never slept comfortably." Bessières, Macdonald, Masséna. 20 down, 6 to go. Join us for the next part of Napoleon's Marshals as we reveal our top 6, coming soon.
Ooh. All right, there we go. We are getting pretty close to the end. We've got 2 parts left. I'm very much excited to get into these top 6. All very prominent names amongst this very prominent bunch. I really enjoyed this episode. I will say, for me, and you can probably tell from my commentary, that the standout in this episode was definitely Mcdonald. Not just because he's Scottish. For those of you that don't know, by the way, I'm from Scotland. I was born there, then moved to the United States. So, you know, I've got an allegiance to my birth country, of course, but not just because he was Scottish. You know, I appreciate that. I mean, first off, he was a talented and skilled commander. I think Messena has him beat there, but Mcdonald was still very talented. You know, he was consistent, and he was loyal to Napoleon, you know. He was loyal for a long time, until it didn't make sense to be loyal anymore. You know, more than that, he was loyal to his country, and he wanted to do what was best for France. I do believe that, and when he felt that Napoleon was no longer best for France, and I think it was pretty clear at that point, he, you know, he took the action that a lot of other of Napoleon's officer corps did, and told him they had to abdicate. I don't necessarily see that as a betrayal. I think Macdonald was just doing what he thought was right, and you know, maybe for some of the other marshals it was a betrayal. I won't deny that. But for Macdonald, we can see throughout his career that he always did what he believed in. He always spoke his mind, and he always acted based on his principles, not on what other people expected him to do. And I really respect that. You know, he seems like a pretty stand-up guy, you know. Regardless of any military success or failure, though he was fairly successful, just him sticking up for his principles, regardless of the damage it could do to him personally. I think that's something pretty respectable. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this reaction. If you did, I'd appreciate it if you would leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below and has exclusive reaction content. I hope all you guys are having a good day today, and I will see all of you again next time. Goodbye.